Hi, Mrs. Brown here. I'm making this video in lieu of having a review session so that you can just watch this whenever you want. And I just want to go through some stuff for Unit 6, which for us is learning and behaviorism, and talking about our three main categories: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning, observational learning. So I have literally just written stuff down that I wanted to go through, and so I'm just gonna tell you some stuff to help you remember, and you can just use this to help jog your memory as you are reviewing for your test. So here we go. Our first category is classical conditioning. Remember, classical conditioning and operant conditioning are forms of associative learning. And for classical, it's more automatic. It's not a decision that someone or something is making. It's more automatic, physical, involuntary behavior. And we call this respondent behavior. So like for Pavlov's experiment with the dogs, their respondent behavior was drooling or salivating. So if we're talking about classical conditioning, it's going to be respondent behavior, which is automatic, versus like operant conditioning, where we're going to have operant behavior, which is a choice that someone or something is making. Okay, so our main person that we want to know for classical conditioning, other than Rescorla, is Ivan Pavlov. Okay, so Ivan Pavlov is the dog salivating experiment guy, and we had some terms that you should review: the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, which was the neutral stimulus, and the conditioned response. And you need to remember that, like, if you have a scenario, you need to make sure that you can go through and say what is the UCS, UCR, CS, and CR. Remember that conditioning is most effective when the unconditioned stimulus immediately follows the conditioned stimulus. So like, we're going to ring the bell and then present the food, ring the bell and then present the food. If you wait too long in between, the learning doesn't take place. There's no acquisition of learning. So it's most effective when it's immediate, okay? Speaking of acquisition, that's the moment of learning. That's a term we want to know. And then extinction, when the learning stops. So it could be that the conditioned response just loses strength, but then we could have spontaneous recovery as well, that reappearance after a rest period of the extinguished conditioned response. So review acquisition, extinction, and spontaneous recovery with this as well. We did talk about John D. Watson and Rosalie Rayner's baby Albert or little Albert experiment, where they classically conditioned little baby Albert to fear the little white fluffy rat, and then he generalized that fear as well. So go back and look at the baby Albert experiment for classical conditioning and conditioned fears. And then we also talked about the Garcia effect and taste aversion, and how we can kind of link that food or that substance to that state of unpleasantness, and we try to kind of avoid that food or situation with that food because of the Garcia effect. So those are some things we talked about for classical. Moving on to operant conditioning. Okay, operant conditioning, like I said, is a choice. You're either choosing to do a certain behavior or not, okay? And so this is not respondent behavior, it's operant behavior, because it's not automatic, it's not physiological, it's, you know, I am going to exhibit this behavior or I am going to stop this behavior. And then one thing we talked about is punishment and how that can help to stop behavior, but we cannot motivate behavior with punishment. We can only motivate behavior with reinforcement. So that's something to think about. So again, operant behavior is voluntary behavior, it's purposeful, and it's usually shaped by behavioral consequences, so reinforcements and punishments. So the first person we talked about with this is Edward Thorndike, and Thorndike's law of effect, that rewarded behavior is more likely to be repeated. And Thorndike's puzzle box is something that we talked about as well. You can go back and review that. But the main person we want to know is B.F. Skinner, who was actually influenced by Thorndike to come up with the operant chamber or the Skinner box. And he really came up with operant conditioning. Now, remember, Skinner is kind of criticized for not acknowledging cognitive influences or free will. So like, you can reward me all you want, you can punish me all you want, but sometimes I'm not going to do something because I'm a human, and if I don't want to do it, I'm not going to do it. So that's something to keep in mind. The behaviorists really didn't acknowledge free will, and that is a criticism of them. So B.F. Skinner talked about shaping using training with rewards. We played hot and cold in our class, and I showed you kind of how that helps to motivate them to reach the desired behavior by shaping every step of the way with rewards. We talked about reinforcers, which help to motivate that behavior and continue that behavior, and punishers, which help to stop bad or aversive behavior. So aversive means bad, negative, things that we don't like. Only reinforcers can motivate the start or encouraging of a behavior. Punishment stops behavior, it does not motivate behavior. And then we talked about negatives and positive with each one. So negative punishment, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, positive reinforcement. And I told yourself you need to know all of the different scenarios, just like UCS, UCR, CSCR for classical, and you have a scenario, you pick that stuff out. Same thing for negative and positive reinforcement and punishment for operant. So if you have a scenario, you need to say, is it negative reinforcement, negative punishment, whatever it is, okay? So ask yourself 2 questions. Are we giving something or are we taking something away? If we're giving something, it's positive. If we're taking something away, it's negative, okay? That's the first question. Second question, do we like the behavior and want to have it continue? If so, it's reinforcement. Is it a bad or aversive behavior and we want it to stop and not repeat? If so, it's going to be punishment, okay? So if we want the behavior to continue, it's reinforcement. If we're giving something, it's positive. If we're taking something away, it's negative. All right, and then we talked about different types of reinforcers, primary versus secondary. So primary is a biological reinforcer. It's way more powerful in general than secondary reinforcers. So primary things like water, food, things we need to survive. Sex is considered a primary reinforcer. And then we have secondary reinforcers, which are also called conditioned reinforcers. Secondary is conditioned. And it's things that we have learned to associate our rewards. So things like, money or grades or whatever. Okay. We also talked about reinforcement schedules. So another thing with the scenarios, you're given a scenario, you have to talk about which reinforcement schedule it is. Okay. First of all, is it continuous or partial? So if it's continuous, you're reinforcing every single time. Faster learning, but also faster extinction, okay? Partial, slower learning, slower acquisition, but more resistant to extinction. So partial, you're not reinforcing every time, it's more realistic. And then with partial, we have our schedules. So we have fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, variable interval, okay? Fixed is always, we know when it's gonna happen and it's predictable. Variable, we don't know when it's going to happen and it's unpredictable. It's variable, okay? It varies. For ratio, it's a number, or an amount. So like every 10 times, every 6th time, whatever it is, okay? If it's interval, then it's amount of time. Every 3 hours, every 6 days, bi-weekly, okay? So if you're talking about an amount of time that's elapsing, it's going to be interval versus number of times or number of things or an amount, it's going to be a ratio, okay? So partial extinction or partial reinforcement is more resistant to extinction, specifically variable ratio, okay? Because we don't know when it's going to happen and it makes it much more motivating. So for example, like slot machines, variable ratio is very motivating for people to continue. So that's something, it's more resistant to extinction, okay? And then we're gonna move to social learning theory or observational learning, which is a way that we make decisions to behave a certain way by observing others and making decisions to mimic that behavior or not mimic that behavior. Okay, so the main person we want to know here is Albert Bandura. Bandura did the Bobo doll experiment, where they looked at modeling and imitation with children and aggression, and whether or not if they saw the adult beat up the Bobo doll, if they would also beat up the Bobo doll or repeat the same offensive language, or if they were nice to the Bobo doll, would the children then be nice? And can we teach aggression through modeling? And this is what Bobo was really famous for, okay? So children, yes, will imitate that behavior of a role model, and aggression can be modeled and learned through observation. So that's something that we learned through that. One thing we talked about with this was mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are a type of neuron located in the frontal lobe of the brain. They are active when we are modeling behavior, or we're going to be imitating behavior, and it also enables us to have empathy for others. So mirror neurons help with empathy, help us to relate and understand how someone else is feeling, and that helps us to know whether or not we also would repeat that behavior or not. Okay, so yes, that's observational learning. Other random things I just want to throw in here. Latent learning is something that we talked about. It's not obvious until later that you know something, okay? So like you learn something and then later on you realize, oh, I actually do know that. That might be latent learning, okay? Versus insight learning is like instant insight. It's a sudden realization, like, aha, oh wait, I know this, okay? And so, yeah, so insight is instant, latent is later on. And one thing we talked about with that is Tolman's experiment with the rats, and realizing, that they knew later on, they knew that. So that's something you can look at. And also with Tolman, the whole cognitive map thing and the spatial layout and the mental picture of something, that's something that will come back with cognition. So, yeah. We also talked about habituation, and my class, we did this last unit as well, where we talked about sensory adaptation versus habituation. Sensory adaptation was just like in that one experience over a prolonged time. Habituation is after many exposures or many experiences, you start to not notice something. For example, like with a train. So like I live next to a train. In the beginning, I heard it all the time. I really noticed it. Now, because I've experienced it so often, I've become habituated to it. I no longer really notice it or pay attention, okay? So go back and look at habituation. Biofeedback is another term where we can kind of control physiological responses that are usually involuntary or respondent behavior. And so this is kind of a manipulation of classical conditioning and enables us to learn to control those physiological responses. So like intentionally doing things like meditation or breathing strategies to slow the heart rate would be an example of biofeedback. So that's something that psychologists are experimenting with now. And then also go back and look at learned helplessness, which is our sense of powerlessness, or, we've learned through experience that we don't have a lot of control over a specific situation, and so we stop trying. So like, for example, let's say that you tried studying and you still got an F, and instead of trying different techniques or trying a new, and being resilient and trying to study different ways and get help, an example of learned helplessness would be, why should I study? I'm going to fail either way. There's no point. Okay, and so that's an example of you feel the sense of powerlessness, which ultimately is not good for you and your goals as a human, but is a term that we see with learning, that if you've experienced something over and over again that it's going to be a certain way, you may give up on trying to change the outcome because of your experiences with that. Okay, so those are some things to think about: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational or social learning theory with Bandura, and the different things that go underneath. But use the use the PowerPoints, use AP Classroom, take those practice tests, use the study guides that I gave you and the different handouts that I gave you in class, use your textbook, your practice questions in your textbook, the practice FRQs, your terms cards. Terms are everything. Okay, study your terms. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.